For 20 years, Nolan Reed believed his wife had died beneath the black water of Blackwater Lake. A burned-out car had been pulled from the lake, and the remains recovered inside had been identified as Maren Reed through dental records. Nolan had stood beside a closed coffin, held his 3-year-old son against his leg, and learned how a man could keep breathing after the shape of his life had been torn away. He raised Elliot alone after that. He built Reed Restoration from a rented bay into a small but respected garage on the edge of Blackwater. He learned to cook meals a child would actually eat, to sign school forms with grease still under his nails, to work late without letting Elliot know how close some months came to breaking them. 20 years later, grief no longer ruled Nolan's days. It had simply become part of their architecture, like an old beam hidden behind finished walls. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon at Blackwater Station, he looked across a crowd and saw Maren alive. She stood near the ticket counter, older and thinner than the woman in the photographs Nolan kept buried in a drawer, but unmistakably herself. Her dark hair carried a few pale strands now. Her shoulders were tighter. Her eyes moved constantly toward exits, windows, reflections. Beside her stood a young woman with dark hair, a familiar jaw, and gray eyes Nolan had seen only in his own mirror and in Elliot's face. The station smelled of diesel, wet concrete, and coffee. A departure board clicked overhead. Nolan forgot the crate of Mustang parts he had come to collect. He forgot the rain on his coat. He forgot how to move. Then he said her name. Maren. She flinched as though he had struck her. Her hand closed around the young woman's wrist. Don't say my name. For words, barely louder than the station noise, and the world Nolan had spent 20 years rebuilding shifted beneath his feet. Maren pulled the young woman toward the side doors. Nolan followed. They stepped into cold rain, and he caught up on the sidewalk. How are you here? He demanded. I buried you. Maren's attention remained fixed across the street, where a black SUV sat idling with dark windows. Not here. 20 years, Maren. Please. I watched them lower your coffin into the ground. Her face tightened. Nolan, if you want answers, get us somewhere private. He almost laughed at the cruelty of the request. Private. As if privacy were the problem. As if 20 years could be carried into a quiet room and explained. Then the young woman looked at Maren and asked, Is he really my father? Nolan stopped hearing the rain. The young woman's voice was steady, but her fingers had curled around the strap of her bag. Maren closed her eyes for one brief second. That was answer enough to make Nolan's knees feel unreliable. He took them to the old storage building behind Reed Restoration, not because he trusted Maren, but because he needed the world to stop moving long enough for him to understand what had happened to it. Rain drummed on the metal roof. A bare bulb buzzed over shelves of carburetors, hoses, cracked gauges, and parts Nolan had never found a reason to throw away. He sat on an overturned crate. Maren stood across from him, both hands around a paper cup she did not drink from. The young woman remained near the work table. She watched Nolan carefully. Start with her, Nolan said. Maren swallowed. Her name is Sloan Hart. The surname sounded wrong even before Nolan knew why. Sloan seemed to feel it too. She said it like a name borrowed for travel rather than one worn comfortably since birth. I'm 20, she said. I turned 21 in 3 days. Nolan's gaze went back to Maren. You were pregnant? I didn't know when I left. When you left? The phrase landed harder than died. Survived, or daughter? Maren did not retreat from it. Yes. Nolan looked at Sloan again. She pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the work table. It was a small motion, almost nothing. Elliot did the same thing when he was trying not to show anger. Nolan had done it all his life. He hated that he noticed. He hated even more that some part of him wanted to believe what it meant. She told me my father died before I was born, Sloan said. 2 weeks ago, she told me that wasn't true. Why 2 weeks ago? Nolan asked. Because I made her, Sloan said before Maren could answer. I've spent my whole life moving. Different towns, different names, different reasons. She always had an explanation. 2 weeks ago, I stopped accepting them. That mattered to Nolan. Sloan wasn't simply following her mother back into danger. She had demanded the truth and forced herself into the center of it. Do you believe I'm your father? He asked. Sloan looked at him for a long moment. I believe you might be. The honesty stung less than certainty would have. Good, Nolan said. Because I need proof. Maren nodded immediately. You should. She reached into her bag and placed a photograph on the work table. Nolan recognized the scene before he recognized himself. Elliot at 3, wearing a red backpack, Nolan holding the boy's hand outside his preschool. Nolan remembered that morning. Elliot had cried in the truck because one shoelace kept coming loose. Nolan had retied it 3 times. The photograph had been taken 12 years after Marin's death certificate was issued. Nolan turned it over. No writing. No explanation. Where did you get this? Silas Crow sent it to me. The name came from a part of Marin's old life Nolan had tried not to remember. Silas had been security director for the Wycliffe family. Nolan had met him twice. Quiet man. Expensive coat. Eyes that seemed to inventory every doorway. Why would Silas send you pictures of us? Nolan asked. Marin took a breath. Because I wasn't dead. And because for years he was the only person I trusted to tell me whether you and Elliot were still safe. Nolan rose so quickly the crate scraped backward. Safe from who? Marin finally looked directly at him. Gideon Wycliffe. Nolan knew the name. Marin's uncle. After Augustus Wycliffe died, Gideon had taken control of Wycliffe Crown Holdings, the company Marin had spent most of their marriage trying to forget. Her family had never forgiven her for marrying a mechanic. Marin used to joke that the Wycliffe name was a heavy coat she could finally take off when she walked through the door of their little house. Nolan had believed distance had freed her from it. Marin told him how wrong they had been. 3 days before the Blackwater Lake crash, she had discovered that Gideon had been siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars from the company's employee pension fund through shell companies. She had also found financial filings carrying forged versions of her father's signature. She gathered what she could and planned to take it to federal investigators. Gideon learned she was looking. He did not call her. He did not threaten her in person. An envelope appeared on her doorstep containing photographs of Nolan and 3-year-old Elliot taken without their knowledge. He wanted me to understand something, Marin said. He didn't have to threaten you if he could show me he could reach you. Nolan stared at the old preschool photograph again. Suddenly, it no longer looked like evidence of love. It looked like surveillance. And Silas helped you disappear. Yes. Marin explained that a car resembling hers was driven to Blackwater Lake, burned, and sent into the water. Remains inside were later identified as hers because the dental records used for comparison had been substituted. Nolan felt sick. So someone died in that car. Marin's face went pale. Yes. She did not look away. And I have lived with that too. Nolan remembered the coffin. The pastor's voice. Elliot asking why he couldn't see Mommy one more time. The official who had told Nolan the fire had made viewing impossible. He had accepted the explanation because grief did not make a man suspicious of dental charts. It made him want the worst day of his life to end. You let me bury someone else under your name. I did. You let Elliot stand there. I did. Marin's eyes filled, but she did not ask him to comfort her. Silas said Gideon would only believe I was dead if your grief was real. If you knew, even a little, Gideon's people might see it. Nolan's voice dropped. So you protected us by deciding what we were allowed to know. The sentence made Marin look away. Sloane looked at her mother. Something in that exchange told Nolan this was not the first time Sloane had asked a version of the same question. Marin said she had believed the disappearance would last months. Silas was supposed to build a case, secure protection, and bring her home. She learned she was pregnant after leaving Blackwater. For a time, Silas remained in contact. He sent occasional photographs showing Nolan and Elliot alive. Marin wrote letters back. She wrote about the pregnancy, about Sloane's birth, about wanting to come home. Then Silas vanished. Every channel Marin had used through him went silent. She no longer knew whether he had been discovered, compromised, or killed. She moved from Oregon to Montana, then north toward the Canadian border, later to a coastal town in Maine. Some places lasted weeks. Others lasted years. Sloane grew up learning not to grow attached too quickly. And you never contacted us yourself? Nolan asked. At first I believed it would lead Gideon straight to you. At first. Marin's silence confirmed the distinction. And later, she looked down at her hands. Later fear stopped being the only reason. Sloane turned fully toward her mother. Nolan said nothing. Marin deserved the space to answer without rescue. I got used to surviving, she said. That's not an excuse. It's the ugliest truth I have. Every year made coming back harder. Every birthday I missed became another thing I would have to explain. I told myself you were safer. Then I told myself you had rebuilt your lives. Eventually I couldn't tell where caution ended and cowardice began. Nolan felt anger move through him. Cleaner now because she had not tried to disguise her responsibility as sacrifice. You don't get to call the decision merciful because you were the one making it. I know. Elliot grew up without a mother. I know. I grew old believing my wife was in a grave. Marin's voice nearly failed. I know. Sloane spoke softly. Did you use the same lie on both of us? Marin looked at her daughter. What do you mean? You told them you were dead to protect them. You told me my father was dead to protect me. Did you ever notice that everyone you protected was also someone you didn't trust with a choice? Marin did not answer quickly. When she did, it was barely above a whisper. Yes. Nolan looked at Sloane with new respect. She wasn't there to complete anyone's family. She wanted control over her own life, something Marin's fear had denied her too. Nolan could understand that. His own instinct had always been to shield Elliot from pain by carrying the worst parts himself. Hearing Sloane put the pattern into words unsettled him. Why now? He asked Marin. Why 3 days before her birthday? Marin took a thick folder from her bag. A silver crown was embossed on the cover. Wycliffe Crown Holdings. Augustus Wycliffe had created a trust holding 51% of the company's voting shares. Gideon had only been managing those shares because Marin had been declared dead. Under Augustus's terms, control would return to Marin or pass to her biological child when that child turned 21. The transfer would also trigger an audit of the pension accounts Gideon had spent years burying. That's why the birthday matters, Marin said. If Sloane's claim is recognized when she turns 21, Gideon loses control of the shares and the books open. And if it isn't? Nolan asked. He's trying to close a sale before then. Once he does, tracing what he moved gets much harder. Sloane looked at Nolan. I don't want his company. That isn't why we're here, Marin said. Then why are we? Sloane asked. Marin held her gaze. Because thousands of employees lost retirement money, and if Gideon finishes that sale, he gets to walk away with what he stole buried under paperwork. There it was. Marin had not come back only because she wanted Nolan. She had not come back only because Sloane had demanded a father. She had come back because the deadline created one last chance to finish what she had failed to finish 20 years earlier. Where's the original trust? Nolan asked. I only have a copy. Silas hid the original before he disappeared. Days earlier, Marin had received a recording released by a lawyer handling Silas's estate after confirmation of Silas's death. Silas's message said the document had been concealed inside something belonging to Nolan. Nolan knew before he consciously moved. The old wooden toolbox Marin had given him when Reed Restoration first opened. It had sat in the storage room for 20 years. They crossed the rain-dark lot to the garage. The back door had been forced. Drawers lay open. Shelves had been disturbed. On the wall behind the workbench, someone had written a warning. The dead should know better than to stop staying buried. Nolan's first instinct was to send Sloane away. You shouldn't be here. Her expression hardened instantly. No. Sloane, you met me 3 hours ago. You don't get to start making choices for me because we shared DNA. The word stopped him. Marin remained silent. Nolan looked at the damage around them. He wanted Sloane somewhere safe because he had lost enough people. He also recognized, with discomfort, the same logic Marin had used for 20 years. Protecting someone could become another name for controlling what they were allowed to risk. Nolan nodded once. Fair. The toolbox still sat in its usual place, though its drawers had been emptied. Nolan opened it. Nothing. No trust. No envelope. He searched the compartments and found only old wrenches, loose sockets, and dust. Marin's face fell. Nolan could see the clock running behind her eyes. 3 days. A copy no board would honor. An heir not yet legally proven. A dead woman who had no official standing. Nolan called Delaney Price. They had known each other since school, and she was the only lawyer he trusted enough to bring into a story that sounded impossible. She arrived late that night, reading glasses pushed into her hair, listened without interrupting, examined Marin's copy of the trust clause, and told them what Nolan already suspected. This may be genuine, she said, but Gideon's lawyers will attack a photocopy. We need the original or enough evidence to stop the board from acting before Sloane's birthday. Delaney also said they needed defensible proof of Marin's identity and Sloane's paternity. Nolan immediately thought of Elliot. Then he immediately decided against calling him. No. Delaney looked at him. Nolan, Elliot is a forensic data auditor. If Gideon hid money through shell companies and controlled storage firms, Elliot may be the best person you know to trace the trail. He spent 20 years getting past this. Marin flinched at the word this. I'm not dragging him back into it until I know what we're dealing with. You already know enough, Delaney said. The question is whether Elliot gets to decide if he wants to be part of it. Nolan's jaw set. He heard Sloane's earlier words again. You don't get to start making choices for me. He had spent Elliot's childhood deciding which burdens a boy could carry. That had been necessary when Elliot was 3, 8, 13. Elliot was not a child anymore. Nolan took out his phone. I'll tell him everything I know, he said. Then he decides. Elliot arrived the following morning expecting to rescue his father from a fraud. He had rehearsed the conversation during the drive. Patient tone, no accusations, get Nolan away from the women, contact someone if necessary. Then he walked into the garage and saw Marin. The resemblance to old photographs was immediate. His prepared speech vanished. Marin took one step toward him. Elliot stepped back. Don't. She stopped. Okay. He stared at her face as if anger might expose a seam in it. Where were you when I turned 10? Marin did not answer with Gideon or Silas. Gone. When I graduated? Gone. When Dad worked nights because the roof needed replacing? Nolan started to speak. Elliot. Elliot turned on him. No. You call me here to let me decide. Let me ask. Nolan closed his mouth. That silence cost him more than speaking would have. He wanted to tell Elliot that Marin had been threatened. He wanted to keep the boy he remembered from hurting more than necessary. But Elliot was 33 now. He owned his anger. Nolan let him have it. Elliot looked back at Marin. Where were you? Hiding. Afraid. And later, too afraid of what coming back would cost. I'm sorry. That's it. No. But anything longer right now would be me trying to make my reasons carry more weight than what happened to you. They don't. Elliot's eyes shone, but he refused tears. I don't forgive you. I understand. Sloane had watched from the far side of the room. Elliot finally noticed her. And you're my sister? Maybe, Sloane said. We're still proving that. Something about the answer lowered the temperature by a degree. Elliot looked around, needing somewhere else to put his attention, and settled on the wooden toolbox. You said Silas hid something in this. Nolan nodded. Someone already searched it. Elliot crouched and ran his fingers along the base. Maybe they searched the obvious places. The toolbox sat higher than its internal depth required. Elliot removed a liner and found a false panel. Beneath it was an antique pocket watch Nolan recognized from old Wycliffe family photographs. Augustus's watch. Inside the case was a small brass key and a handwritten string of numbers. Elliot's anger did not vanish, but his professional instincts took over. These aren't random. Within hours, he traced the sequence to a safety deposit box frozen on the date Marin was declared dead. It was a clue, not proof. Delaney filed to gain access. That move told Gideon they were closer than he wanted them to be. By afternoon, local news was carrying photographs of Nolan and Marin at the train station. Wycliffe Crown Holdings described Marin as an imposter and Nolan as a grieving mechanic being manipulated in an extortion attempt. Customers called Reed Restoration to cancel work. Others simply stopped appearing. Nolan's bank accounts came under review. Police arrived on an anonymous complaint alleging stolen Wycliffe documents were being stored at the garage. Delaney kept the search within the warrant, but the damage was already public. Nolan watched officers move through the place he had built with 20 years of work. A customer who had known him since Elliot was in grade school drove past twice and never came in. Nolan felt the old instinct rise again. Send Elliot home. Hide Sloane. Get Marin out of Blackwater. Carry the damage alone. Instead, he called them together after the police left. This is getting worse, he said. Nobody stays because I say so. Nobody leaves because I say so. But we decide with the same information. Elliot looked at him carefully. You're actually asking? I'm trying. Sloane folded her arms. I'm staying. Marin said, so am I. Elliot's answer came last. I didn't drive here to forgive anybody. But if someone stole pension money and used my mother's death to cover it, I'm finishing the audit trail. For the first time, Nolan let his family choose the danger with him instead of choosing for them. Gideon arrived at the garage not long after. He came alone, wearing a dark coat that looked absurdly expensive under Reed Restoration's fluorescent lights. His shoes clicked over concrete still marked by police boots. He walked past the half-restored 1967 Mustang and ran a gloved finger along the fender. You restore old things, he said. Some things should stay gone. Nolan did not rise to the bait. Why are you here? Gideon placed a folder on the workbench. $20 million for a signed statement declaring that the woman calling herself Maren Wycliffe Reed was an imposter. You owe her nothing, Gideon said. If she is who she claims, she watched you mourn her for 20 years. She watched your son grow up without her. Consider the money compensation for being used again. Nolan hated that the argument found a wound. Not the money, the resentment. 20 years of birthdays. The coffin. Elliot asking where his mother went. Maren deciding for all of them. For several seconds, Nolan imagined ending it. One signature. The garage saved. Elliot protected. Sloan removed from the fight. Gideon saw the hesitation. Truth is an expensive luxury, Mr. Reed, he said. Most people don't actually want it. They want a life they can survive. Nolan looked at him. Gideon continued, almost kindly. That's what your wife finally understood. She survived because she accepted that some people are better equipped to decide what others need to know. The words hit Nolan differently now. Gideon had just described Maren's flaw as a virtue. He had described Nolan's too. Power, in Gideon's world, meant deciding what truth someone else could handle. Sloan Meredith Hart doesn't need you dragged through this either, Gideon added. Nolan went still. Sloan's full legal name had never been released publicly. Only Maren, Sloan, Nolan, and Delaney knew it among those Gideon had any reason to monitor. Say that again. Gideon's expression shifted by half a degree. It was enough. Nolan understood. Gideon had known about Sloan before the train station. Perhaps for years. The offer was not mercy. It was containment. Nolan pushed the papers back across the workbench. Get out. Gideon glanced at the Mustang, then at Nolan. You think dignity makes you difficult to destroy? No, Nolan said. I think the truth does. Gideon gave a thin smile. Truth only matters when someone powerful agrees to recognize it. He left. Nolan watched the door close and understood exactly what they were fighting now. Not only a man who had stolen money. A man who believed control over information was the same thing as control over reality. Delaney arranged a discreet paternity test under controlled supervision. When the result came back, it confirmed Sloan was Nolan's biological daughter to a probability leaving no reasonable doubt. Sloan read the result twice. Nolan did not reach for her. Being her father biologically did not give him permission to decide the speed of anything else. You okay? He asked. She nodded, then shook her head. I don't know. That's allowed. She looked at him. Are you going to tell me you knew from my eyes? I suspected. That's not the same. No. A small smile almost appeared. Delaney warned them that paternity solved only one question. They still had to establish Maren's identity, validate the trust, and connect Gideon's actions to the evidence. The chain was forming, but it was not complete. That evening, Gideon contacted Sloan directly. His message did not ask her to betray anyone. It merely suggested that Maren had lied about more than Nolan, and that there was something Sloan deserved to know about the night her mother vanished. Sloan did not tell Nolan or Maren before arranging a meeting at the Wycliffe family's downtown hotel. She knew they would try to stop her. That was partly why she went. For 20 years, her life had been organized around information other people believed she should not have. She refused to repeat the pattern by asking permission now. Gideon met her in a quiet lounge of muted gold and marble. Employees greeted him by name. No one looked twice at Sloan, though she had just learned that, if Augustus's trust was valid, she might soon control the majority of the building around them. Gideon placed documents in front of her showing that Maren had once been offered entry into a formal witness protection program and had declined. The information did not prove Gideon innocent. It did something more dangerous. It changed the meaning of Maren's story. Until then, Sloan had understood her mother's absence mainly as something forced upon her. Now she knew there had been at least one formal path offered out of hiding, and Maren had chosen not to take it. Gideon leaned back. Your mother will tell you she was protecting you. Sloan said nothing. People like that always call it protection. It sounds kinder than control. The irony nearly made her laugh. And what do you call what you've been doing? Gideon's smile thinned. Survival. Same word she used. Ask her why she refused protection, Gideon said. Don't take my word for it. Sloan did. She returned to the garage furious, not because Gideon had convinced her he was trustworthy, but because the document was real. Maren did not deny it. They offered protection, Sloan said. You said you had no way out. I said I didn't believe I had a safe way out. That's not the same thing. No. Marin explained that entering the program would have required surrendering the evidence she had gathered and turning control of her future over to officials she was not certain Gideon had failed to reach. More painfully, it would have meant committing permanently to a new identity while pregnant, with no guarantee she could ever restore Sloane's place in the Wycliffe Trust or expose what Gideon had done. "So you chose the evidence," Sloane said. "I chose what I believe gave us a chance to stop him later. And you chose for me." Marin absorbed the blow. "Yes." Nolan stood nearby and felt the meaning of everything shift. Marin had been a victim of Gideon's coercion. That remained true. She had also made consequential choices after the immediate coercion, choices shaped by fear, but still her own. Both truths could exist. Nolan realized his anger did not require him to turn Marin into either a villain or a saint. "I understand why you were afraid," he told her. "I still think you were wrong." Marin nodded. "So do I." Elliot, meanwhile, followed Silas Crow's old digital trail. The records were fragmented, but patterns emerged. Dozens of letters Marin had written toward Blackwater had been rerouted to a storage facility controlled by a security company linked to Wycliffe interests. Elliot found mailing data, transfer records, and archived routing entries. Gideon had been intercepting Marin's attempts to communicate. The final recovered letter was dated only a week before Silas vanished. In it, Marin wrote that she intended to return to Nolan and Elliot despite the danger. Elliot read that sentence alone twice before showing anyone. It did not erase the years after Silas disappeared. It did not make him ready to forgive her. It changed one thing he had believed since she walked into the garage, that she had never tried. "You wrote this?" he asked. Marin recognized the date immediately. "Yes." "You meant it?" "Yes." Elliot looked at the routing record. "It never got here." "No. I still don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it." He folded the copy carefully. "I'm keeping it." Delaney pursued the identity question separately. She located Lydia Voss, the forensic pathologist who had signed the original identification after the Blackwater Lake recovery. Lydia had left the county coroner's office years earlier. When Delaney confronted her with the inconsistencies, Lydia admitted that the dental records provided for comparison had been changed before she reviewed them. She had suspected something was wrong only after the identification was finalized, when access to the original file was blocked. She had stayed silent out of fear for her career and safety. Now, 20 years later, she agreed to provide a sworn statement and testify if Delaney secured legal protection. Lydia's statement corroborated Marin's claim that the death identification had been manipulated. It still did not prove the trust. The bank finally opened the safety deposit box tied to Augustus's watch. Nolan, Marin, Sloane, Elliot, and Delaney went in expecting the original document. They found an empty envelope and a photograph showing Miles Harrow, Wycliffe Crown Holdings' longtime chief financial officer, removing material from that very box 10 years earlier. The discovery landed like a physical blow. The trust had existed. Someone else had taken it. Sloane's 21st birthday was less than a day away. Gideon scheduled an emergency board meeting to approve the foreign sale before midnight. Reed Restoration was nearly empty. Nolan's accounts remained under scrutiny. Marin was still legally dead. Sloane's paternity was established, but without the original trust, her corporate claim remained vulnerable. Elliot's records showed intercepted letters and suspicious financial pathways. Lydia could prove the death identification had been compromised. None of it, by itself, put the controlling shares in Sloane's hands. For the first time since the station, Marin's discipline broke. She sat on the edge of Nolan's workbench and stared at the empty bay where customers should have been waiting. "Maybe we came back too late." No one answered immediately. Elliot looked toward the office window. 2 framed photographs sat on the shelf inside. One showed him at 12, holding his first rebuilt carburetor. The other showed Nolan standing beside the garage the week it opened. Elliot swallowed. "Dad could lose this because of us." Nolan turned. "No. Your customers are gone. Your accounts are frozen. Police searched your shop. Elliot, you spent 20 years building a life after she disappeared, and now 3 days after she comes back, we're watching it get torn apart again." Marin lowered her head. The words hit where Elliot intended them to. "He's right," she said. "No," Nolan repeated. "I made my choices." Marin stood. "And if I leave now, Gideon may stop pressing you." Sloane's face tightened. "Don't." Marin looked at her. "I'm not saying I'm disappearing. You're already thinking like it. Silence. Sloane's voice dropped. Every time things get dangerous, you decide you're the problem and everyone else is safer without you. Then you call leaving love. Marin's eyes filled. I don't know how to watch this happen to them again. Then don't leave, Elliot said. Everyone looked at him. His expression was hard, almost angry at himself for saying it. I'm not forgiving you. I'm not asking you to stay for me. But if you walk out now because you think you've decided what protects us, then nothing changed. Marin stared at her son. For the first time, Elliot had not offered forgiveness. He had offered a boundary. Nolan felt the weight of that distinction. Sloane wrapped her arms around herself. Tomorrow is my birthday, she said. And all I've been able to think about is whether the day I turn 21 is the day Dad loses his garage, Mom disappears again, and I become the reason everyone gets hurt. Nolan crossed the room, then stopped before getting too close. You're not the reason. Sloane looked at him. You don't get to decide what I feel either. Nolan almost answered, then caught himself. You're right. He waited. But I can tell you what I'm choosing. I'm not staying because of the shares. I'm not staying because of Wycliffe Crown. I'm staying because if we leave every time Gideon makes the truth expensive, then he gets to keep deciding what truth is worth. Elliot looked at him. Marin wiped at her cheek. Nolan continued, quieter now. Nobody owes this fight to me. Do you want to stop? Marin shook her head. No. Sloane. She took a breath. No. Elliot. He looked around the garage, at the half-restored Mustang, the empty work bays, the woman he still could not call Mom. Definitely not now. Nolan nodded. Nothing was fixed. The trust was still missing. Gideon still held power. The garage was still bleeding. But the family had reached the lowest place without repeating the old solution. Nobody disappeared. They drove together to Wycliffe Crown headquarters as evening light faded across the glass facade. Security stopped them in the lobby. Marin Wycliffe Reed did not legally exist as a living person. Gideon's staff had instructions not to recognize her. Delaney presented Lydia's sworn statement and demanded the board delay any irreversible action while Marin's identity was challenged. Gideon appeared before the argument was settled. Several board members were arriving behind him. He looked at Nolan and gave the room a mild, almost sympathetic smile. This is the mechanic? He asked, loud enough for others to hear. The one being used by the imposter? Nolan felt every eye turn toward his work jacket and worn hands. Gideon wanted shame. Nolan had spent his life fixing machines for people who believed money made their time more valuable than his. He had nothing to prove about the dignity of work. I'm the mechanic, Nolan said. And that's Marin. Gideon smiled. According to whom? According to the pathologist whose identification your version of events depended on, Delaney said. She raised Lydia's statement. And she now says the dental records were substituted. The lobby changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Board members stopped moving toward the elevators. Gideon no longer looked amused. A frightened retired employee revising a memory after 20 years proves nothing, he said. It proves the death record cannot be treated as unquestioned fact, Delaney replied. And that is enough to stop pretending this woman has no standing. Gideon looked at Marin. Standing is what institutions grant you, not what you feel entitled to. Marin met his gaze. That's what you've always believed, isn't it? If you control the institution, you control the truth. I control what survives scrutiny. No, she said. You control what people are too afraid to challenge. Then another voice came from behind them. She's right. Miles Harrow stood near the entrance, visibly shaken. Gideon's face hardened. Miles, go upstairs. No. That single word did more than shouting could have. Miles acknowledged that the photograph from the safety deposit box was real. He had removed the original trust document 10 years earlier. Gideon stepped toward him. Be careful. Miles gave a tired laugh. I've been careful for 30 years. That's the problem. Silas Crow had asked Miles to move the document because he feared a bank vault was no longer secure from Gideon's reach. Miles kept it hidden after Silas disappeared. He also kept silent because Gideon threatened to make him the sole public face of the company's financial fraud if he ever spoke. For years, Miles convinced himself that silence was survival. Then Gideon structured the foreign sale in a way that would finish draining and scattering pension assets thousands of ordinary employees depended on. That was the point Miles could no longer rationalize. I helped you hide too much, he told Gideon. I'm not helping you steal their retirements. From his briefcase, Miles produced the original trust document. Delaney did not celebrate. She checked seals, signatures, and identifying marks against the copy Marin carried. The original trust established the controlling share clause. The paternity test established Sloan as Marin's biological child and Nolan's daughter. Lydia's statement corroborated that Marin's legal death rested on manipulated identification records. Elliot's records showed that Marin's attempts to contact Nolan and Elliot had been intercepted through Wycliffe-linked channels. The deposit box photograph explained why the original trust had disappeared. Miles's admission explained where it had gone. One clue had led to another. Each answer had created the next question until there were no important gaps left to hide inside. Delaney insisted the board convene before any vote on the sale. This time security stepped aside. Upstairs, the evidence was laid across a long mahogany table, one piece at a time. Gideon tried to isolate every item. A compromised death record did not prove inheritance. Paternity did not prove the trust. A trust did not prove fraud. Intercepted letters did not prove corporate control. Delaney let him finish. No single document has to prove every wrong you committed, she said. The trust establishes who controls the shares. The remaining evidence is enough to stop the sale, recognize Sloan's claim subject to formal administration, and open the financial records to investigators. Gideon looked around the table. You are about to hand control of this company to a girl who has never sat in a board meeting. Sloan sat near the place once reserved for Augustus Wycliffe. She looked younger than everyone around the table because she was. She also looked more tired. Nolan watched her glance toward Marin, then toward him. He did not nod. He did not tell her what to do. He had finally learned that being her father did not mean directing her decision at the moment it mattered most. What do you want? He asked quietly. Gideon heard him. She has no idea what she wants. She's 20 years old. Sloan turned toward him. For another few minutes. Gideon leaned forward. You think midnight makes you qualified? Sloan shook her head. No. Then listen to people who understand what this company is. I have. You are about to destroy generations of work because your mother came back from the dead with a grievance. Sloan's voice remained calm. No. I'm about to stop you from deciding what everyone else is allowed to know. The clock moved past midnight. Sloan turned 21. Under Augustus's trust, Gideon's temporary stewardship over the disputed shares ended. With the original document authenticated and the board formally recognizing the transfer taking effect, Sloan gained the deciding voice over the controlling shares while the remaining administration proceeded. Gideon stared at her as though waiting for revenge. What do you want? A board member asked. Sloan looked at the financial binders stacked near Delaney. Open everything. The board member hesitated. Everything. Every record connected to the pension fund. Every shell company. Every transfer. Give federal investigators unrestricted access. Gideon's face changed. Sloan continued. I don't want revenge. I don't want a company I never asked for. I want nobody else deciding what the truth is allowed to be. The room went silent. Gideon's empire did not collapse that night with shouting or violence. It began collapsing under documents. Within days, he was suspended and faced formal charges involving fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Former allies began cooperating rather than carrying his risk for him. The foreign sale was stopped. Wycliffe Crown Holdings entered restructuring under new oversight. Marin refused suggestions that she become chief executive. Her objective had never been to reclaim a throne. She insisted that the depleted pension fund be restored to the employees it had been taken from and supported independent day-to-day oversight. Sloan retained the voting authority the trust gave her, but refused to let inherited wealth become her identity. She intended to finish her education and participate only in the company's most important ethical decisions. For Nolan, victory did not repair 20 years. It merely removed the lie that had prevented repair from beginning. Elliot did not call Marin mom. He did not hug her in the boardroom. He did not pretend the recovered letters had returned his childhood. When Marin asked whether she could write to him, Elliot gave her his real address. No intermediaries, he said. No disappearing if the answer is uncomfortable. No disappearing, Marin promised. Sloan asked Nolan whether he wanted a second paternity test now that the result no longer carried the same legal urgency. Nolan looked at her gray eyes and smiled faintly. No. Because you knew at the station? Because we proved it once. I don't need to keep asking you to prove you belong here. She absorbed the difference. She still did not call him Dad. Nolan did not ask her to. Marin waited until they were back in Blackwater before asking Nolan for anything personal. Reed Restoration was quiet. The Mustang still sat unfinished under shop lights. She stood beside the wooden toolbox that had carried a secret through most of their lives. I don't expect us to go back, she said. Good, Nolan replied. Her eyes lifted. Good, because there is no back. He had worn his wedding ring on a chain for years after her death, before eventually putting it away. He did not retrieve it now. The marriage we had ended when the world declared you dead. Maybe it shouldn't have. Maybe it was built on a lie. But Elliot and I lived 20 years after it. You and Sloan lived 20 years after it. We can't erase those people because we found the truth. Marin nodded slowly. I know. If there's anything between us now, it has to be new. No secrets for protection. No deciding what someone else can survive. No pretending forgiveness is the same as forgetting. I can live with that. Nolan looked around the garage. Can you start with tomorrow? Marin's mouth trembled into the smallest smile. Tomorrow sounds good. Healing came slowly enough to be believable. Elliot allowed Marin to write. At first, he answered every third letter. Then every second. Months later he agreed to dinner. They argued during the second dinner and still scheduled a third. That mattered more than a perfect reunion would have. Sloan returned to school and visited Blackwater during breaks. She worked part-time at Reed Restoration, though she proved mediocre with tools and openly admitted it. Nolan never pushed. One afternoon she identified a failing engine by sound before he did. He looked at her in surprise. What? She asked. Nothing. That's a lie. You heard the timing issue. So? Nolan smiled. Elliot does that too. Sloan rolled her eyes, but later Nolan caught her smiling at the car when she thought he wasn't looking. Marin and Nolan did not remarry. They dated carefully, which sometimes felt absurd after everything they had once shared. They disagreed over ordinary things. Marin still packed too quickly whenever plans changed. Nolan still mistook silence for strength and occasionally had to be reminded that other people could carry their own fear. When he caught himself telling Sloan what she should do instead of asking what she wanted, he corrected it. When Marin felt the urge to hide bad news until she could control the outcome, she said it aloud instead. Their change was not proven by promises made after the board meeting. It was proven by repetition. Truth told early. Choices returned to the person who owned them. Doors left open. Letters answered. Dinners rescheduled instead of abandoned. A year after Marin's return, Blackwater had settled into a different kind of ordinary. Reed Restoration reopened fully under a freshly painted sign. Nolan kept the old wooden toolbox in his office, not as a shrine to what had happened, but because it remained useful. Wycliffe Crown Holdings continued restructuring under independent oversight, and pension money was gradually restored to the workers who had been robbed. Gideon awaited trial, while people who once protected him chose cooperation over loyalty to a collapsing system. Elliot met Marin for dinner every few weeks. He still did not use the word mom casually. Sometimes he did not use it at all. No one forced him. Sloan spent part of her school breaks at the garage, usually in jeans permanently stained with grease. Marin came and went through the front door instead of appearing from shadows. Nolan and Marin were still learning one another. Some evenings they found old rhythms. Other evenings they discovered those rhythms belonged to people they no longer were. They let both things be true. In the fall, Nolan finally completed the 1967 Mustang, whose parts he had gone to the train station to collect on the afternoon his dead wife returned. The car gleamed beneath the shop lights. Sloan stood beside him while he listened to the engine idle. Sounds clean, she said. It is. She leaned toward the open window, listening more closely. Maybe slightly rich. Nolan looked at her. You're getting annoying. Inherited trait. From your mother. Nice try. She walked around the rear of the Mustang and caught Nolan's reflection in the side mirror. For a moment neither spoke. A year earlier, she had stood beside Marin at a train station and asked whether a stranger in the rain was truly her father. Since then Nolan had given her something more difficult than a blood test. He had given her room. Room to doubt him. Room to be angry at Marin. Room to decide what the Wycliffe name meant. Room to leave Blackwater and come back because she wanted to. Sloan rested one hand on the roof of the Mustang. Dad. Nolan's hand stopped over the wrench on his bench. He did not turn immediately. He had imagined the word often enough that hearing it for real felt quieter than imagination. When he finally looked at her, Sloane seemed almost embarrassed by what she had said. Nolan did not make it larger than she intended. He did not cross the room and trap the moment in an embrace she had not asked for. He simply smiled. Yeah. Sloane glanced toward the engine. You want to admit I'm right about the mixture? Nolan laughed softly. Absolutely not. She smiled back. Autumn light entered through the open bay door and settled over the restored car, the old toolbox, the worn concrete, and two people who had lost 20 years they could never reclaim. Nothing had been restored to what it was before. That was never the miracle. The miracle was that once the lies were gone, they stopped trying to rebuild the past and began building something honest enough to survive the future.